Iliad's idea was this, that things fall apart of their own accord merely because they age. That's the first motif in the flood story. And that's only to say that if you build something, it decays. If you build something and you just leave it the hell alone, it will soon not work, right? And that's entropy. So one of the reasons that the flood always threatens is merely because of entropy. And you see that reflected in the Egyptian story, because one of the reasons that Osiris falls prey to Seth is because he's old. You know, he was a great hero when he was young and created the Egyptian state, like the men of renown. But now he's old, and it's worse, he's willfully blind. But that's the next thing. But the fact that he's old is just a start. Things fall apart of their own accord. So once something is given to you, you have to maintain it just to ensure its continued existence. And so you actually have a contract with most of the things that you own. It's like a moral contract. Let's say you have a car. Well, you've decided that you're going to sacrifice to have the car. And so you've performed an ethical calculation. But the car was only worth the sacrifice as long as it functions as a car. And so what that means is that to justify the sacrifice you made to have the car, you have to maintain the car. Because otherwise, you're acting out the proposition that the thing you sacrificed for actually didn't have any value, and so you're obliterating that as a useful contract. And you run into the situation where the car will just deteriorate of its own accord, and then you won't have a car at all. Well, so let's say, how do you speed the process by which your car deteriorates? Well, that's easy. You're driving it along the road and it starts to make a ticking noise. Tick, 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 tick. And you think, I should go have that ticking noise checked because you've heard it. And then you think, no, it won't matter. It's like, yeah, probably it'll matter. And what does matter mean? Well, matter is mother. That's chaos too, you know, matter. But what it means is that that little ticking noise is the birthplace of Tiamat in your car. That's a good way of thinking about it, is that it's your first indication that the dragon of chaos is going to manifest itself in your car. That happens when I've got a funny story about that. So I had a friend in graduate school, someone I really liked, but I wouldn't call her mechanically inclined, let's put it that way. And she had an old Honda, and those things were notorious for rusting out. This is 30 years ago when they were first produced. They weren't adapted well to Canadian winters. And we used to go in her car, in her Honda, and it got a little on the scary side because it was so rusty underneath that you could actually see through the floorboards. And that actually made me nervous, because if you can see through the floorboards, that means that they're not really floorboards. What they are is like rust. And so I mentioned the fact that that might be a problem to her a couple of times, but she was sort of blithe about it. And one day she was driving down St. Lawrence Street in Montreal, which is the main street running roughly north and south, and her hood popped up. It bent and popped up spontaneously. And so she was really curious about that. And so she was with this friend of hers who was just as clueless mechanically as she was, which is really quite remarkably clueless. And so they pulled off into a service station and had the guy come out and look at it. And well, he opened the hood, obviously. And what had happened was the body had fallen off the frame. So, and what had happened was the shock, which is like supposed to be attached to the car, had pushed up through the hood. So literally the car body had like fallen onto the ground, but she managed to drive the car. Okay, so look, I wouldn't exactly call that willful blindness, because perhaps there was an element of willful blindness. She didn't know anything about mechanics, but you get the point, right? It's like, let's say she would have been in a fatal accident. You might say, well, you can shake your fist at God for producing the circumstances, but you know, the fact that you could see through the floorboards, that's probably something that you might have paid attention to. And so it's always the question, is that if things fall apart around you, to what degree is it the mere tendency of things to degenerate entropically, because they do that of their own accord, or have you sped the probability of decay by failing to pay attention when a little snake manifests itself inside your paradise?